Sagittarius. A secret meeting about you just ended, and someone left in tears. Sagittarius, somewhere beyond the reach of clocks and walls, a gathering has just dispersed. Not in any place you could walk into, but in a realm where the air hums with truth and every heartbeat is recorded in light. You were not physically present, yet you were the reason it began. It was a private council, of souls who know you, of ancestors who remember you, of the universe itself, called to speak about what has been done to you and for you. No accusations were made, no punishments declared. And yet, someone left that gathering with wet cheeks, carrying a grief they could not name. It wasn't because you struck back, you didn't have to. The truth had stepped forward on its own, unshakable, undeniable. That truth did not come to expose you. It came to confirm you, to remind everyone, seen and unseen, that you have never been small, never been forgettable. Perhaps you can feel it even now, that subtle shift in the air, as if something heavy has just been lifted from your path. This is not the kind of story that ends with revenge. It is the story of your light being defended in places you cannot see. If these words stir something deep inside, stay close. Walk with me through this unfolding. Like, share, subscribe, not for the algorithm but to remain part of a space where your soul is understood without you having to explain. Gate 1. When they laughed at the pain you hid. There was a time, Sagittarius, when you believed that truth was enough. That if you spoke from your heart, raw, unpolished, vulnerable, those who claimed to care would lean closer, listen, and maybe even love you more for it. You believed that honesty was a bridge, not a weapon. And so with trembling courage you shared your story. Maybe it was about something that broke you, maybe it was about the quiet ache you carried for years. You thought your openness would bring you closer to them. But instead you saw it, the tightening jaw, the impatient glance, the smirk playing at the corner of someone's mouth. The invisible wall rose up, and your truth was left standing alone on the other side. Some didn't even pretend to hide it. They laughed. Not always out loud, but in that way that makes you wish you could swallow your own words back. You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. You're being dramatic again. As if your feelings were theater. As if your pain existed for someone else's critique. It didn't matter that you weren't trying to make a scene. You were simply telling the truth of what you had lived. The most painful part was not that they didn't believe you. It was that they made you question yourself. You replayed the conversations late at night, wondering if you had exaggerated. You rewrote the story in your head, softening the edges, just to see if it would make them more comfortable. And slowly you began to do the most dangerous thing of all. You stayed silent. That silence wasn't born of weakness. No, it was a survival instinct. You learned to read the room before speaking, to measure your words like currency, to give only what felt safe. But here's what they never understood. Every time you chose silence instead of spilling yourself out for people who would only mishandle it, you were keeping your light intact. You weren't hiding because you were afraid. You were preserving the parts of you that deserved sacred care. And yet, even as you retreated, something unexpected began to happen. The pain you had been forced to hold became a strange kind of teacher. You learned to walk through rooms without explaining yourself. You learned to forgive in ways that didn't require the other person's permission. And with every instance of quiet dignity, your light didn't dim, it deepened. It became heavier, richer, like a stone polished by time and tide. I think of a woman I once knew. Her name isn't important, but her story might feel familiar to you. She grew up in a home where tears were seen as weakness, where the only acceptable emotions were the ones that made everyone else comfortable. When she was 17, she tried to tell her family about something that had happened to her, something that had left her feeling hollow and broken. They told her to stop being so dramatic and just get over it. She didn't tell anyone else for years, but instead of letting that moment destroy her, she became fiercely observant. She could walk into a room and feel the temperature of every heart in it. She became the kind of person who could sit in silence with someone else's pain without needing to fill it with words. Years later, when those same people who had dismissed her went through their own heartbreak, they turned to her, not because she had forgotten, but because she had become someone they couldn't ignore. Sagittarius, this is what I mean when I say your silence has been misunderstood. To them it looked like defeat, but in reality it was the first stage of transformation. Your stillness was the cocoon. The world thought you had gone dormant. The truth is, you were becoming something they wouldn't recognize until it was too late. And it was this, your resilience, your quiet strength, your refusal to let bitterness take root, that summoned the meeting beyond this world. Imagine it. A circle of souls, some you've never met in this lifetime, some who have loved you across centuries, speaking your name like a vow. They did not gather to pity you. They gathered because they saw what the living missed, that your endurance was not passive but powerful. They know, even if the world doesn't, that not every battle is won with noise. Sometimes the most extraordinary victories happen when you choose not to fight on their terms at all. You've been planting seeds in the dark, Sagittarius, and the people who mocked you for your silence will one day be blinded by the forest that grows from it. But here's the truth that matters most. Not everyone will see your worth. And that's fine. You were never meant to be for everyone. Your value does not fluctuate according to someone else's ability to recognize it. Somewhere in a space beyond time, your truth has already been witnessed, recorded, and honored. And that means the work is already done. When you remember this, their laughter loses its edge. It no longer cuts into you. It dissolves into the background noise of lives too small to hold the vastness of yours. Your silence, your restraint, your light. These are not accidents. They are the very reasons the universe has moved to defend you, even in rooms you cannot enter. So if they laughed, let them. The sound of it will fade, but the light you carry, that will only grow louder. Gate 2. They once thought you were small, but they were wrong. There is a strange, almost poetic cruelty in the way people underestimate you, Sagittarius. It doesn't happen overnight. It begins slowly in little moments. When someone interrupts you mid-sentence as if your words aren't worth the air they take up. When they talk about your dreams as if they are charming but unrealistic. When they reduce your pain to a passing mood instead of a wound that reshaped you. At first, you think they simply don't know you well enough. But over time, you begin to realize that they don't want to know. Because knowing you in your fullness would mean they could no longer feel bigger, stronger, or more in control. And so they keep you small, or at least they try to. Through subtle jabs, quiet manipulations, and that particular brand of gaslighting that makes you doubt whether the sky is blue when you're looking right at it. They craft a version of you in their mind. Dependent, uncertain, easily swayed. They tell themselves you need them. They tell themselves you would be lost without their guidance, their approval, their validation. But here's the thing they never counted on, you were taking notes. Not to use against them, but to understand yourself more deeply. You were learning what it felt like to have your truth denied, so that one day when someone else tries to do the same, you will recognize it instantly and refuse to play along. You were learning how to stand without leaning on hands that would gladly let you fall. And while they were busy imagining you as fragile glass, you were becoming tempered steel. Somewhere along the way, their narrative began to unravel. Not because you fought back with the same weapons they used, but because you stopped participating in the story they had written for you. You started making choices that didn't need their approval. You started trusting your own instincts, even when those instincts went against what they told you was best. And most importantly, you stopped seeking their permission to exist in the fullness of who you are. I think of a man I once met, we'll call him Daniel. For years, he worked under a boss who constantly reminded him that he wasn't leadership material. Every suggestion he made was dismissed, every accomplishment minimized. Daniel believed it for a long time. He thought he was lucky just to have a job, that maybe his ideas really weren't good enough. But one day, the company had a crisis. A major project was about to fail, and his boss was nowhere to be found. Daniel stepped in. He organized the team, solved the issues, and delivered the project on time. It was the biggest success the company had seen in years. His boss tried to take credit, but the truth had already spread. The narrative shifted overnight. Suddenly, Daniel wasn't just an assistant anymore. He was the reason the company had survived. That's how it works, Sagittarius. The light you carry eventually exposes the shadows, whether you intend for it to or not. The people who underestimated you don't cry because you hurt them. They cry because they have to face the truth about themselves. Your presence becomes a mirror they can't look away from. And what they see is not flattering. They see the harm they caused, the support they withheld, the faith they refused to give. And in that moment, they realize that none of their efforts to contain you worked. The universe doesn't need to punish them on your behalf. It simply restores balance. And balance has a way of making things undeniably clear. Those who sought to dim your light are now illuminated by it. And sometimes, that's the most unbearable justice of all. It's important to understand that this isn't about revenge. You don't win by watching them suffer. You win by no longer caring whether they ever recognize the truth. The freedom comes when you can look back and think, I survived you. I outgrew you. I am not the same person you once had power over. That is the victory. And here's the lesson. When you live in alignment with who you really are, you don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to prove your worth to those determined not to see it. The truth will rise on its own like the sun, and when it does, it will shine so brightly that even those who tried to ignore it will have no choice but to notice. So let them think you are small. Let them underestimate you. Every time they do, they are only making your eventual rise more undeniable. And when that moment comes, you won't need to tell them they were wrong. The proof will be standing right in front of them, in the way you carry yourself, in the peace you hold, in the life you've built without their permission. Gate 3. You no longer belong to the old frequency. There was a season in your life, Sagittarius, when you kept telling yourself, if I just try a little harder, they'll see me. If I just explain it better, they'll understand. You stayed longer than you should have in rooms where your light was dimmed, where your laughter had to be edited, where your dreams had to be downsized to fit someone else's comfort. You thought love meant endurance. You thought belonging meant bending. But here's what you've begun to understand. No matter how much you shrink, you will never be small enough to fit inside a space that was built to contain someone else's truth, not yours. The frequency you once lived in, the emotional and spiritual vibration you once called home, has become too tight for your soul. It's like trying to wear the clothes you had as a child. They don't fit, not because you've done something wrong, but because you've grown. There's a strange discomfort that comes with this growth. You look around and realize that the conversations that once kept you engaged now leave you restless. The people you once leaned on no longer feel like the ground beneath your feet. The old dramas that used to consume you no longer hold your attention. And yet, part of you resists letting go because those patterns, those people, those places, they are familiar. They have been part of your identity for so long that stepping away feels like betraying a version of yourself. But you are not betraying yourself by leaving what no longer serves you. You are betraying yourself if you stay. I think of a young man named Arjun, who spent years trying to keep his friendships alive even as he evolved. He stopped drinking, started meditating, and began working toward building his own business. But every time he met up with his old friends, he felt like he was being pulled backward into a version of himself that no longer existed. They still wanted to talk about the same parties, the same gossip, the same complaints about life. He tried to steer the conversation toward growth, toward dreams, but the more he did, the more they teased him for being too serious now. One day he realized that he wasn't actually losing them. He was simply outgrowing the space they shared. And when he finally stopped forcing himself to fit back into it, a new circle of people appeared. People who didn't just understand his vision but shared it. That's the truth about leaving an old frequency. It feels like loss, but it's actually liberation. The connections, opportunities, and truths that are meant for the new, you cannot find you while you're still hiding in the old room. The secret meeting the universe held on your behalf wasn't just about defending your name. It was a declaration, a line drawn in the spiritual sand. Those who once held influence over your narrative no longer have the authority to shape it. They may try to speak into your life, but their words will no longer land the way they used to. Their opinions will slide off you like water on glass. Not because you've hardened, but because you've shifted. Your energy no longer resonates with theirs. And here's the subtle beauty of it. You don't have to slam the door. You don't have to explain your departure in a speech or a confrontation. The separation happens naturally, like two radio stations drifting out of sync. They'll notice that they can no longer reach you in the way they once could, but they won't be able to name why. And you'll simply feel lighter. The challenge is to trust this process without trying to force closure where none is needed. You don't have to convince them you're right for leaving. You don't have to gather evidence of how much you've changed. You simply have to keep walking toward the places and people that feel expansive, where your presence isn't something to be managed or diluted, but welcomed in its entirety. Sagittarius, this is the lesson. Forgiveness is not an invitation to return to the old frequency. It is a gift you give yourself so you can travel unburdened into the next chapter. It is saying, I release you from my energy and I release myself from yours. The door doesn't slam, it dissolves. And once you're fully on the new frequency, you'll wonder why you stayed in the old one for so long. You'll breathe differently. You'll speak differently. You'll notice that even your body feels different, lighter, steadier, more at peace. You'll see clearly that the old space wasn't wrong. It was just complete. And your soul was ready for the next landscape. So let the old frequency fade. Don't mourn the static. You're tuning into something clearer now. Something that was always meant for you, but could only arrive once you stop bending yourself to fit the signal of someone else's life. Gate 4. You are no longer the victim, you are the chosen one. There was a time, Sagittarius, when your story felt like a series of trials you hadn't agreed to. Life seemed to keep placing you in positions where you had to prove yourself, defend yourself, or survive situations that were never meant to be fair. You told yourself that once people understood the truth, you could finally rest. You thought that justice meant someone standing up and saying they were right. We were wrong. But somewhere along the way you realized you didn't actually need that moment to move forward. Because something had shifted. The scales had turned, not because anyone handed you an apology, but because you stopped needing one. The moment you no longer required their acknowledgement to feel whole, you stepped out of the role of the victim. Not into the role of the victor, because this was never about winning or losing, but into the role of the chosen. Being chosen isn't about being better than anyone else. It's about being entrusted with something sacred. It's about the universe saying, I know you can carry this and still remain whole. The fire you walked through didn't burn you down. It refined you. Every misunderstanding you endured, every dismissal, every betrayal, they didn't shrink you, they tempered you. And here's the quiet truth. Your power now is not loud. Doesn't need to be. You no longer seek the room's attention, because your presence alone shifts the air. People may not know why they feel different around you, but they do. They sense the steadiness in your gaze, the way you don't flinch under scrutiny anymore. The way you don't rush to fill silences or defend yourself. You carry an energy that says, I know who I am, and I don't need you to agree. I once met a woman named Alara who had spent years trying to earn the love of her family. No matter what she did. Success, kindness, generosity, it was never enough to draw out their acceptance. One day she stopped trying. Not out of bitterness, but because she realized her worth didn't depend on their recognition. She began investing her energy into the people and projects that brought her joy. Over time, her light became impossible to ignore. The same family who once treated her like an afterthought began to speak her name with pride. But by then she didn't need their pride. She had built a life that was already full without it. That's what it means to be chosen. You are no longer waiting at the door, hoping someone will let you in. You've built your own space, one where the right people arrive naturally and the wrong people don't even think to knock. Sagittarius, the secret gathering that was held for you wasn't just a council of protection. It was an initiation. A recognition that you have completed a cycle that many never break. You have learned to live without bitterness, to hold your dignity even when others tried to strip it from you, to keep your heart open without letting it be trampled. That is rare. That is sacred. And that is why you have been chosen. In this space, you no longer measure your worth by who stays or who leaves. You no longer take it personally when someone cannot meet you where you are. You understand that not everyone is meant to walk beside you. Some are meant to teach you, some are meant to challenge you, and some are meant to leave so you can grow into who you were always meant to be. And the beauty is, you don't need to erase what happened. You don't need to pretend the pain wasn't real. You carry it differently now, not as a wound but as wisdom. Every time you walk into a room, that wisdom moves with you. It shapes the way you listen, the way you speak, the way you see the world. It is your crown, and it cannot be taken from you. So no, you are not the victim anymore. You are the chosen one. Not because life spared you hardship, but because you turned every hardship into a stepping stone. Because when others lost themselves to anger or resentment, you chose another path. And now the universe moves with you, not just around you. This is your power. And it doesn't need to be announced, it simply is. Conclusion. The truth has been confirmed, and you need do nothing more. Sagittarius, the gathering has ended, but its echo is still moving through your life. The truth that was spoken there has already been set into motion, not by your hands, not by your arguments, but by the quiet authority of the universe. Those who once dismissed you now carry the weight of their own choices. Not because you wished it, but because energy always finds its way back home. This is not the season for proving yourself. It's the season for living as if you already know who you are, because you do. The battles that once drained you have no claim over you now. The old rooms, the old frequencies, the old narratives, they are behind you. You've stepped into a space where you no longer wait for permission, no longer hope for recognition from the wrong places. You are no longer trying to fit into lives that were never built to hold your truth. From here, everything changes, not in a sudden blaze, but in the steady unfolding of a life lived in alignment. You'll notice more ease, more clarity, more moments where you simply know you are in the right place with the right people. And when challenges come, because they will, you'll meet them with the calm of someone who has already walked through fire and come out shining. So take this as your confirmation. You are seen, you are protected, you are guided. And if these words have stirred something in your spirit, keep walking with me. Like, share, subscribe. Not for the sake of numbers, but so this space can remain a place where your soul is met, understood, and reminded of its own light.